Hi, Carlos. Good evening.
Good evening, Lucia. Yes. Pleasure to see you. Yes, very good. What about you?
Yes. Hi, Carlos. How are you? I think that with us is our last class, right?
Yes, I think so. I
think
yes.
It's our last class.
Yes, I think so. I think it is. Oh, it's very sad. It's very sad. I always love to have your group and to talk with you, Lucia.
Yeah.
But anyways.
Yeah, it was a really nice group with us.
Yes, certainly. But anyways, we can continue in touch, right? Through WhatsApp anyways.
Yeah, of course.
When I go to Cochabamba, I can visit you someday.
Of course. We're gonna have a guide tour for Cochabamba.
Yes, of course. And if you come here as well. All right.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Carlos. It was really nice to have you as my teacher. I really have learned a lot.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Lucia. It's a pleasure to listen to that. Thank you. Fantastic. So let's see if okay, we can start, I think, because everybody has already entered. Okay, thank you very much, students, for joining me tonight. It's a pleasure to be with you. I know it's Friday. Maybe many of you are about to go out with your friends. Of course, it's fantastic that because we are I think that all of us had a very long week with a lot of activities. Some of you university, some of you as well working. And I know that, of course, the weekend is about to come, and that means that we have some liberty to have fun with our friends and to take a rest, right? But nonetheless, before we do that, let us get into our work here and let us practice for the listening section. But I know many of you are longing for that because practicing for this section is very entertaining, very funny, and we're gonna apply everything we have learned before, okay? So let me share my screen, but first of all, I'm gonna stream this on YouTube so you can see it. By the way, I'm gonna let you have today the link, okay, for your group, so you can rewatch the classes later. I'm not sure why the coordinator didn't send that already, but nonetheless, it doesn't matter because I'm gonna do it for you. And by the way, all the classes are already there, so you can see them later. Okay, so we are transmitting into this. Just give me a second. Here we have it. Just a second. All right. There we are. Let's go. Okay, so let's start. So if you remember yesterday's class, what we did was to get into our simulator and then we listened to lectures and to conversations, right? So what we have to do today is to continue with that exercise with the same mechanism. We're going to listen to lectures, to conversations, and then we're going to respond to questions. How are we going to do it? Every single one of you needs to respond to all the questions. You're going to have a paper, of course, because you have to take notes, right? You have your paper and you write down on your paper, what do you think, or which one do you think is the correct response for the question we are having and confronting at that particular moment. If you think it's the first one, you write down number one, the second, the third one, the fourth one. Okay, so for every question, you have to write down your response on a paper, maybe on your cell phone, whatever, you can find it later. Okay, so you take your responses and take note of it during the entire questions. But just one of you is going to respond publicly and basically aloud so that we can compare those responses later at the end, okay? And to give some feedback to check out if your criteria for responding is correct, is appropriate, or maybe you are taking some wrong concepts and transmitting that into your response, and that maybe that's the reason why you get it wrong, and we can make mistakes here because that's the reason, right? Why we are practicing to make mistakes here and not to make them later, but to be constant during our practices and on the exam as well. So let's go. Let me share my screen with you, and we are going to be practicing. Not sure. Okay, fantastic. Here we are. So let me press this button here, and let us listen to a lecture in a class on acoustics. So probably this is going to be a physics class or a music class. I'm not sure because the word acoustics is used in both contexts, but nonetheless, as I say, take your piece of paper, take your pencil, and start writing down your notes that I think that you have comprehended this until this point. It's very important for us to remember later. Okay, so let's go and listen to this class on acoustics.
Listen to part of a lecture in a class on acoustics.
Next, I'd like to discuss sonar. So, simply put, sonar is the use of acoustic measurements to locate objects, usually beneath the water. In other words, sonar analyzes echoes to figure out where things are under the surface. Now, there's a unique echo characteristic of each individual object you see. Now, there are two kinds of sonar, active and passive.
Professor Milton, how can an object like a shipwreck that's been lying on the ocean floor for years produce an echo? It's completely dormant.
Ah, that's because the echo isn't of a noise sent out from the shipwreck. It's sent out from the ship, the sonar device. That's why we say this is an active sonar transducer. In active sonar, a signal of sound is transmitted through the water. You may have heard of the words pulse or ping to describe this signal. It's a short pitch, but it travels at the speed of sound. And because we know the precise speed of sound and water,
then we know by the time until the echo of the signal gets back to the transducer how far away the object is.
Exactly. And in which direction it can be found too. The sounds emitted from the transducer are sometimes audible, but often they're ultrasonic. That means the pings are so high-pitched they're beyond the capabilities of perception by the human ear. But the transducer is equipped with a special receiver for these kinds of signals.
I get how sonar measures the distance of objects, but what about size? How does the transducer tell a fish from the Titanic?
Well, some are equipped with extremely high-frequency devices, which are things that gauge the sound properties of the echo in such a sophisticated way, in such a fine manner, that contours, textures, and even the size of objects can be assessed. Yes, Mark?
This technology's been used to discover long-lost shipwrecks, right?
Yes, Mark. Sonar equipment has helped solve the mysteries of some long-lost shipwrecks, but its everyday use is a bit more boring, mundane. Stuff like, how deep is the ocean floor here or there? What kind of rock or soil is there for drilling? Is there oil or gas below? The sonar echo is quite useful to many kinds of scientists, geophysicists, seismologists, oceanic cartographers, and even doctors.
Doctors? So sonar can actually be used on land?
Sometimes. Sonar is an acronym for Sound Navigation and Ranging. It's not very, strictly limited to use in water, but it's particularly useful for oceanic charting and exploration, because sound waves travel farther in liquid than light waves or radar do. Those are two object detection systems that are more effective above the surface of the water.
Isn't sonar used in nautical warfare too? Submarines and ships send out the ping and the sound wave echo tells them of possible enemy presence, right?
Yes, and actually, warfare is why underwater sonic detection came into existence in the first place. Now, this leads us really nicely into the topic of passive sonar, actually. So, the problem with active sonar in war is that the object, say a submarine, this object located by your ship's transducer, might be able to hear your ping and detect your ship's location as well. This is where passive sonar became useful. Passive sonar doesn't send out a sound wave signal, but instead, it only detects incoming sound from dynamic objects, like ships or marine life.
So how can passive sonar be used to locate things? Well, I mean, can it locate things?
Well, passive sonar can't really locate objects on its own, but multiple passive devices used collectively can determine triangulation of a sound source. But there are limits to the usefulness of passive sonar. Keep in mind that the ocean is full of thermal layers. An abrupt shift in water temperatures can hurt the performance of less sophisticated devices. Sound waves, as well as any echo, may have difficulty penetrating these layers. So, stealth submarines have been known to linger beneath sharply rising or falling thermal layers to avoid detection.
You mentioned marine life. Are they ever affected by sonar signals?
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yes, sadly, active sonar devices in the mid-frequency range have been shown to cause a fleeing response in certain whale species. There's evidence that active sonar signals disturb and confuse them, affecting health and basic life functions like feeding and communicating with one another.
There you are. Fantastic. So, well, very long and very interesting lecture anyways, right? Let's get into the questions, all right? Here we are. So this is the first question. So as you remember, here we have a chronometer that is programmed to emit a sound every single time the minute is fulfilled. So the first person who is going to respond publicly will be Lucia, okay? So please, Lucia, and the rest of you anyways, read and respond on your sheet of paper, but Lucia is gonna share her response with us, okay? So please, Lucia, start responding now.
For me, the answer is A.
Okay, the first one? Okay, thank you very much. There we are. Next. Okay, so the second one will be for Jorge. Jorge, please could you get this one? Jorge Benitez.
Yes.
So please, Jorge.
Option C.
Option C. Fantastic. Thank you very much. There we are. Let's go with, okay, so the third question will be for Sergio. So please, Sergio Nogo, start reading and responding, okay?
I think the answer is A.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Sergio. All right. So next one will be for Raisa. So please, Raisa, check this one.
Option B.
All right, option B. Thank you very much, Raisa. All right, so let's continue. Okay, your minute is over anyways. So please, this is going to be for Sergio, just Sergio, right? Not Sergio Nogo, but Sergio. So please, Sergio, in order to respond this one, you need to listen first of all to a short recording. Let's go.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Yes, sadly, active sonar devices in the mid-frequency range have been shown to cause a fleeing response in certain whale species. There's evidence that active sonar signals disturb and confuse them, affecting health and basic life functions like feeding and communicating with one another.
What does the professor imply when he says this?
Yes, sadly, active sonar devices in the mid-frequency range have been shown to cause a fleeing response in certain whale species.
All right, there you are. Please, dear Sergio, you go for this one, okay? Start now. You have your minute.
Option D.
Option D. Thank you very much, dear Sergio. There we are. And the final question will be for Adriana, okay? Don't worry the rest, because the other reading passage, you're going to be the ones sharing their responses publicly, all right? So let's go for Adriana. This is going to be for you. Start now.
I think that the answer is A and B.
All right, A and B. Thank you very much, Adriana. Fantastic. And I think those are all the responses. Okay, so now that we have finished with this reading passage, well, not reading, I don't know why I always keep saying that, the listening passage or the lecture, let us go and check out your responses, okay? And let us also get the correct ones. Let's go to the first one and let us give you some feedback. There we are. So the first question was, what are the speakers mainly discussing? Here you had some options. The correct one was the technology and purpose of different types of sonars. All right, very good. So, you know, this is very interesting because the fourth response, the technology and purpose of different types of sonars, is a correct response. And let me tell you why. Because if you remember, the main idea of passage is always that one that connects and makes all the information presented a whole or a unity. That is to say, what frames and unifies, all right, a lecture, or in this case, a lecture about acoustics. Now, the timer. So now, for example, the technology and purposes of different types of sonars is certainly the correct one. Because if you think about it, the professor is not merely discussing disparities. For example, the first response is not correct, because the main idea is not to find out the differences between these two types of technologies. The differences are mentioned, certainly. But even if the differences of these two types of technologies or devices were not mentioned in the, or had not been mentioned in the lecture, it would have anyways been understandable that the lecture was about the technology and purpose of different types of sonar. Because when the professor discusses disparities, he had already talked about the technology and the purposes of different systems of sonar, right? He talks about, first of all, the active one that helps us to know the soil and to find shipwrecks sometimes and things of that sort, and warfare as well. And later discusses the passive one, which is primarily used for warfare, right? For wars, for fighting. So as I say, the technology and purpose of different types of sonar certainly frames everything, because that is the idea that makes it a whole. The professor started talking about technology and finalized talking about purposes. So that is the overall idea, right? What connects everything, what makes all the information a whole. The first one is just part of the information, but not what makes it a whole, not what connects it, not what frames it, all right? Military uses of sonar in naval battles is also incorrect, right? Because the use of these sonars in battlefields is just mentioned in a very short manner, because it is discussed that they were not actually very good at the passive, or excuse me, the active sonars were not very good in this particular kind of use, because they were somehow, you know, making you noticeable to your enemy, right? So it is discussed, but yes, surely is not what unifies everything, what frames all discussion on data. And chronology of sonar's development is not really, because the history of how these sonars came to exist is super short in the lecture. It's just a curiosity that the professors mentioned, but it's not the overall idea that unifies everything. All right. Let's go to the next question. The professor implies that sonar is used to find shipwrecks. All right. And here we have to complete the sentence. It's basically a detailed question, anyways. More rarely than it is used for more commonplace activities. Yeah, so basically, if you remember, this is an inference question, or well, yeah, it's certainly a combination almost of an inference and detailed question. I would put it into the inference question because it implies, right? It's out of what he said. But remember, for inference questions, how can you respond to these questions correctly? As I told you, an inference is the correct response whenever you are justified with information from the passage to make a conclusion that is logical and rational from the information you received. In this case, there was a particular part in the lecture, I remember it very well, when the professor said, because one of his students, I think, asked him, is that true when we say that these active sonars are used when we want to find lost shipwrecks? And the professor says, yes, it is used because of that. It has served for that purpose sometimes, but actually its normal use is very boring, right? And he talked about how it was used for detecting soil, the oil beneath the surface, and also the surface of the ocean beneath its observable level, etc., etc. So he says, because of that, you can actually infer that if he said that the uses of this particular technology were more boring than finding shipwrecks, because they were used in many other situations for very common activities as the ones I mentioned, you can infer, hey, it's more rarely used, or excuse me, it's more rarely than it is used for more commonplace activities. That is to say, the active sonar is used to find shipwrecks more rarely, right? Because the professor said, normally its uses are boring. And he mentioned a lot of those uses, finding oil, calculating the surface of the ground, trying to detect the bottom of the ocean and stuff like that. So it's as I say, it's actually very much I think noticeable here that when he says all these things and mentions all these type of uses that have nothing to do with finding shipwrecks, the correct response is that the use of this technology to find shipwrecks is more rarely than used for more commonplace activities, right? Because he said, yeah, it has served for that purpose sometimes to discover some treasures beneath the surface of the ocean, but it has some more common and boring options, right? And he mentioned, so that is the correct answer because you are justified by what the reading passage, I'm sorry, what the listening passage said to infer, hey, because the professor said this, I can infer this. But remember, you cannot make inferences just because it sounds logical to you, but it must be always justified in what the lecture said, in what the listening passage said. And here I'm giving you my justification why this is the correct answer. So always try to have that justification on mind when choosing a particular option, okay? What about the third one, when most other options have already been exhausted? So here, this seems logical, I admit it. This is logical. Of course, maybe they use it when the other alternatives have been already exhausted. Yes, it seems logical, rational, but remember, you need to have a justification in the passage, and nowhere in the passage we are discussing other means of exploration for shipwrecks, not at all. So we cannot infer this because there's nothing in the listening passage suggesting us that we are always going to use this method whenever we have applied the other ones that didn't succeed, right? So because we don't have that, we cannot infer this option. The same with only via passive sonar, since active sonar creates unintended problems. This is not mentioned, so we cannot infer it. Okay, fantastic. Question 3. Which of the following phrases accurately describes passive sonar? And here you got it very well. A less intrusive but also less illuminating method of location. And yes, this is true. Why? Because if you remember, when the professor discussed passive sonar, he gave a very good illustration, right? When a sonar is trying to detect enemies in their submarines, it happens that you can detect them, yes, but nonetheless, you cannot know it directly, because if you emit a signal, just as it happens with the passive sonar, to recover the information and to have the knowledge where your enemy is, that is also going to provoke your enemy to know where you are. So that's the reason why these passive sonars do not give you back the information, but you need to use a lot of devices to triangulate that information later. So as I say, it's less intrusive, that is to say, you are not going to be detected, but certainly, yes, you will be less illuminated because you will have more difficulties to know where your enemy is by using this particular method, right? So I think it was very good in this case. You got it very well. Number 4, why does the professor mention stealth submarines? To show that passive sonar may sometimes be ineffective. And yes, he shows this example, right? Because as I told you, when right after he mentions passive sonar, it talks about ineffective, right? Ineffective. How ineffective this method is, because he says something like, you know, guys, it happens that we are actually not having the opportunity to return the information to the base, because if we share the information again and with our base, our enemy will make it publicly as well that we are in that position, so that we cannot use passive sonars whenever we want to have the information quickly, but we have to use a lot of sonars, of passive sonars, in order for us not to be detected, but of course as well to get the triangulation of our enemy's position. So as I say, it is using this example when he talks about submarines from other people or from our enemy to make the point that this method is certainly ineffective, right? Because although you can triangulate the position, it also discovers you, and you need to make a lot of calculations in order to get the information without being detected, right? So it's talking about inefficiency in the case of passive sonars. That's the reason why he mentioned stealth submarines, right? To say the enemy can also locate you, so you need to be careful, and you need to use a lot of these devices in order for you not to be found, right? So it's part of its inefficiency, something that you don't have, for example, with the passive one that is immediate, but nonetheless it also basically tells where you are, right? So doesn't afford that very well. So what about this one? You got it pretty well. What does the professor say this? Let's see. What is that?
Yes,
What does the professor imply when he says this?
yes, sadly, active sonar devices in the mid-frequency range have been shown to cause a fleeing response in certain whale species.
So he says, yeah, sadly, it has been shown that these sonars provoke some damage in some whales species, right? That is what he said. Now, there is a problem, dear students, here. The reason why he says, the reason why this is the correct answer is because he says, sadly, right? Yes, sadly, it has been shown that these particular mechanisms damage some whales species, right? So because he said sadly, I think it's very noticeable that the correct answer is this one, because it says it is regrettable, right? When he says sadly, he is basically expressing his regret. That is to say how offended or how sad he feels because he finds this method, although it has a lot of good things, as he has mentioned, right? That it has a lot of benefits and it's very useful, it also has some negative consequences. So that's the reason why he says, yes, sadly, it has been shown, etc., etc., etc. So I think it's because of that you can say, well, how can you imply, how can you make an inference? I told you, if you have a justification like the one I'm giving you right now, he's saying sadly, although he has said a lot of positive things about this technology, now he's saying sadly, you have also a negative side. So I think it's noticeable that that's the justification for us to say, yes, he's saying it is regrettable that a technology meant to be an asset also has an undesirable quality, that is that it damages whales and other species, right? So here, the fleeing response would be more drastic if the sonar was emitted at a different frequency. As I told you, maybe this is logical. Certainly for me, it sounds logical. This could be true, but remember, to respond these type of questions of inference, right? When it tells you, what does the professor imply, right? What can you infer of that? You have to consider what the passage says. You need to have a justification in the passage, not just because an option is logical, it means it's the correct one. You need to have a justification and something, a part of a, let's say a part or a sentence in the lecture that says, hey, this can be true. And when you have that particular justification for your inference, you can say, okay, this is the correct answer. But if you don't have a justification and you're just using your reason and your logic, in this case, it doesn't work. Okay, it needs to have a justification that is textually expressed in a lecture. Right? Let's continue. Number 6, the last one. According to the professor, what are notable problems with active sonar? Choose 2 answers. So the first one with active sonars is that it's detrimental to some ocean life. And yes, this is true because we just talked about this, right? It damages some whales species. The professor said this particular phrase specifically. And now the third one is also the correct. Active sonar can be unwise tactic in warfare. And we also talked about this, right? Because the professor said, if you use active sonars with submarines, you're going to know where your enemy submarines are, but they are also going to know where you are. So that, of course, is detrimental. It's not a good idea to basically share your position with your enemy, right? So it is an unwise tactic in warfare. So because of these 2 justifications, you can see, you have to choose the answers that you remember have been mentioned in the lecture. Whenever you have a phrase in mind, hey, the professor said this, so I can choose this one. Or you have a note. That's the reason why notes are very important. Okay, in my notes here says, okay, there was a part in the lecture when the professor talked about how a bad idea would be to use active sonars in warfare because it would allow me to share my position with my enemy, and that would be certainly disadvantageous. Or you say, okay, because I have this justification that the listening passage said this, okay, I can go, okay, this is the correct answer. But if you don't have that justification, you shouldn't go for that one. Okay, as for example, in this one, in the option number B, active sonar only offers an object's location via triangulation. In this case, this response is confusing the information because it is not the active sonar that offers an object's location by triangulation. It is the passive sonar that offers an object's location by triangulation, right? If you listen to it, it is the passive one that needs triangulation because you cannot share it directly with your base, but you need to make a triangulation with more devices, right? So that is the correct response, the first one and the third one, right? Fantastic. Let's go to the next material, and in this case is going to be, well, I'm not sure what it said, but let us listen to this one, and then we're going to respond more questions, okay? Let's go.
Now listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Hi, Professor Carlson. Thanks for letting me meet with you on such short notice.
Hey, my door is always open. During my office hours, at least.
Yeah, so I'm confused about how to do research for my essay.
Right. In your email, you said you weren't sure how to find valid sources of information online.
Yeah, I mean, I do remember what you said in class about not just using random stuff we find on the internet, and I get that, I do. But what kind of online sources can we use?
Well, that really depends on the subject you're looking into. What's your essay about again?
I'm writing about the effects of river pollution, how it impacts wildlife and people.
Okay, yeah. So if you want to find really reliable info on that kind of pollution, you'll want to look at the reliability of the author. And if...
Yeah, but what if the article doesn't give the name of the author? I found a really good study on a government website. It looked at a major river in California, measured the pollution, and showed some damage to the local animals, with photos and statistics. But there's no listed author, and...
Well, that's...
But I can still trust government research, right? Even with no author?
Well, that's what I was trying to say. You can check to see if a source is sponsored by a trustworthy organization. Governments have a lot of interest in regulating pollution and figuring out its effects. So, yeah, that website is probably a valid source for your paper.
So, to find a valid source, I just need to check the author and the website. Company? The sponsor?
Yes, I mean, not just those two things. To see if something you read online is valid, you really have to look at the whole picture. The author, the website sponsor. Also, you need to look at the year. For example, a report on river pollution from a decade ago could be outdated. The situation could have gotten better or worse since then. And then bias. You need to look for bias.
Bias?
Yes, bias. Does the author or publisher have a reason to lie or distort the facts? Suppose, for example, Say you find a write-up on river pollution by a very well-educated scientist. But the scientist researcher's wife is CEO of a company that actively pollutes rivers. In a situation like that, the author could be biased. You know, motivated to understate the amount of damage industrial pollution does.
I think I get the idea, but man, this is confusing. So much stuff to think about when I look at a source.
Well, it sounds like you have found one pretty good source so far. Those government stats. But if you still feel a little shaky, I'll tell you what. Email me links to the next couple of sources you find, and I'll give you some feedback. Tell you if you're still on the right track.
You'd do that? Thanks! I'll take you up on that.
All right, there you are. Fantastic. In this case, it was a conversation, and that is very good, I think, because you need to remember there are two types of materials you can receive, right? In the listening section, you can receive lectures as the one that we listened to before this one, and you can receive also conversations that are shorter and actually have less questions, but let's get into them. All right. The first one will be for Sergio Novo, please. You're going to be responding this question publicly, right? So let's go and start now.
The answer is A.
All right, A, thank you very much, Sergio. The second one will be for Raisa. So please, Raisa, start responding now. You have your minute. There you are. Raisa, please, could you comment your response?
Option B.
Option B, fantastic. Okay, Jorge Benitez, please, you're going to continue with the exercise. Start reading now.
Option B, C, and D.
All right, B, C, and D. B, C, and D. A, B, C, no, B, C, and D, right? A, B, C, D, okay, B, C, D.
Yeah, like that.
Fantastic. Fantastic, thank you. All right, okay, there are some people who have not responded, right? So the next question will be for Myra. Myra, please. I was forgetting that.
Okay. A.
Okay, thank you very much. Camila, please, could you comment on your response here? Which one would you pick? Camila Bucangel.
Okay. I'm still reading. Please.
Okay, continue, please. Tell me which one would you choose? And we are gonna make here a decision.
B.
All right, B. Okay, so it's B for you. All right, so we're gonna leave it in A anyways, okay, because we're gonna take it later, but thank you very much, Camila, for sharing, okay? Okay, so in this one, you have to listen to an audio, right? And in this one, Alondra and Fabian are gonna help me, okay? So please, guys, listen to this one very carefully because you're gonna be sharing with me your responses, okay? Let's go.
Listen again to part of the conversation. Then answer the question.
Hi, Professor Carlson. Thanks for letting me meet with you on such short notice.
Hey, my door is always open. During my office hours, at least.
Why does the professor say this?
Hey, my door is always open. During my office hours, at least.
Okay, so please, Alondra and Fabiana, start responding now.
I think it's C.
Okay, what about you, Alondra? Do you agree?
Option A.
Option A, fantastic. Right, we're gonna leave it in option Z then, just in order to check out if it was correct. But thank you very much to both of you, okay, for sharing with me your response. Fantastic. There you are, okay. And here we have to stop because this is another material, and then let us come back and let us check out their responses, okay? As well, go, and here we are, the first one. So why does the student visit the professor? I think this was a very simple question, right? Because during the entire the chronometer, during the entire conversation, they are talking about advice on research methods for his essay, right? The student was concerned about how could he look for reliable sources to include in his essay for this particular assignment he has, right? So he goes to the professor and talks to her about some sources that he has found, but he doesn't know if those sources or if those websites and pages he has found are reliable and could be trusted for him to present that information in his essay as a justification for all the claims he is going to make, right? So, of course, I think this was very correct response. And remember, how can you identify the main idea of something? Well, thinking. What is the idea that connects everything? What makes it a whole? And I think that if you think about it, in this case, how is the student asking for advice and how the professor responds with some criteria for him to follow in order to get good sources and to include them, into his essay. I think you consider that all of this is what makes it a unity, right? What makes all the information, all the discussion within the conversation to take place and to make sense, right? This particular dialogue situation. Very good. Number two, what about the second question? What does the professor say about sources with not listed author? And here the correct response is if the author is unknown, the students should look for other signs of the source's reliability, right? Because I think this is very good question because it's asking you, right? And the professor talked about this, I think, in the middle of the conversation, because he basically laid on the table a lot of criteria that the student should consider in order for him to decide if a particular source is reliable or not. So I think she gave him like 4 or 3 factors: the date of the publication, possible biases, and also I think it was the recognition of the author. There were more options, but the point is that in this case, when the professor discusses this about the identity of the author sharing the information source, she says, right, hey, if you don't know who wrote this, then you should look for other sources reliability. That is to say, you can look for traits or characteristics, like, for example, the year of the publication. You can look, for example, for, let's say, the impact of that or the use of that particular source in other essays and papers, and et cetera, et cetera. She mentions a lot of options that the student could also consider in order to determine if a source is reliable or it is to be trusted. Because, as I say, she lays a lot of different elements or possible parameters for him to measure if a source is correct and, well, I would say worth to be trusted. But he doesn't, or she doesn't mention just one particular trait. And I think that's the reason why this is the correct answer, because she gives him a lot of options and shouldn't consider just one particular characteristic to decide if that source is reliable or not, but he should look for different ones in order to determine the quality of that source, right? The option B is incorrect, because if the students find a source with no listed author, they should send an email, or they should email, the source to their professor for feedback. This is not actually true, because the only time in which the professor talks about sending emails to somebody is when at the end, right, the professor tells her students, hey, if you are still having troubles with this, email me one of your links, and I'm going to give you some feedback to check out if you are in the right track already. So this is just for a particular case. It's not that all the students should email, right? Let's say their links or their information source whenever they don't know or they are not sure if their source is reliable. This is just a particular case that goes for this student and this professor. So it's not like all the students should do this with their professors, right? That is not what the conversation mentions, but just a particular example for this instance. So this cannot be the correct answer. What about the third option, or excuse me, the third question? According to the professor, what aspects of a source should the students look at? This is what I was talking to you about. The professor mentioned a lot of characteristics they should look for, right? And in this case, you got the response very well. Possible dishonesty or distortion of facts on the part of the author. I like this response, why, dear students, because I think it illustrates very well what I told you some questions ago. I told you, this is, by the way, a detailed question. It's asking you just, what does the passage say about this? And in this case, about what? About the source, right? The aspects of source they should look at. And I told you, right? The correct response for this type of question will always be that one that expresses the same information contained and discussed in the passage, even if it is with different words. And why is this a very good illustration of that particular criteria? Because in the lecture, the professor didn't use these words. The professor used the word bias, right? And bias means exactly what this response is trying to say. Possible dishonesty or distortion of facts, right? But instead of saying all this long sentence, what does the professor say? Bias. So as I tell you, it's not necessary for us response to use the same word. The only thing that needs to do is to express the same information as the passage, and then you could consider it to be a good response. It's correct and could be considered to be a right response. Okay, fantastic. The second one, which company or organization is sponsoring the website? Yes, also the professor talked about this, right? Bias and possible preferences. And finally, the publication date of the source. She talked about this. She said, right, to her students, you should look at the date of a publication, because maybe when it was published, the circumstances, the immediate context was completely different. And of course, you couldn't look at the date and not to consider that the possible implications of that result at that time are completely different to those ones in these times, right? So she basically advises her students to take care of this regard and to continue with their inquiry of a source validity. All right, so let's continue. Number 4, what will the student probably do after receiving advice from the professor? And in this case, the correct response was do more research and send the professor a follow-up email. Now, this is the correct answer. You know why, dear students? This is the correct response because this is exactly what I told you about, right? Some seconds ago, that the professor at the end of the conversation basically tells her students, well, not her students, but her student, to send her an email with the link of the information source he's trying to include in his essay, so that she can give him feedback about this particular source and to identify if he is following the correct track or the correct criteria in order to determine this source validity. But nonetheless, as I say, this is a particular example for this conversation, and that is good. Why? Because the question asks for this particular situation. He says, what will the student, and it means the student that we have listened to, right? The one that was talking in our conversation. What will this student, not all the students, but this student, the male student that we saw, what will this student probably do after receiving advice from the professor? And what professor? The professor that we listened to, the one that was discussing this and giving him some feedback. So what will he do? He will do more research. He said this, right? Oh, that is a lot to consider, but well, I guess we'll have to do it, right? And the professor says, yes, you have to do it because it's necessary to identify all these things. But I think that you have done a very good job with finding that government data, right? That is what he said. That is what the professor says to her student. But as I say, and the fact that the response mentions he will send the professor a follow-up email is what I think should help you to understand the question and to to choose it correctly, because the professor herself mentions this to her student. Hey, send me an email with your information source. I'm gonna check it out. I'm gonna tell you if you are following the right track, right? Fantastic. So what about the first option? What was it incorrect? It says try harder to find articles where the author's name is mentioned. This is not actually the correct response, dear students. Let me tell you why this is not the correct response. It's not correct because the professor, the student never says anything about finding authors' names. Actually, the only mention of this particular topic is when the professor says that if you don't find the name of an author in your source, you should not actually discard it immediately, but you should look for other traits of validity, right? But the student never talks about, let's say, his own investigation, having troubles about, well, authors that are not mentioned in the investigation or any other research, so that he will look for names of these authors later on in the future. It doesn't say that. So remember, this is a detailed question, or excuse me, this is an inference question. And how can you respond to inference questions? Well, by having a justification. What is that justification? In this case, for the correct response, that the professor says, hey, please send me an email. And the student's response, oh yeah, would you do that for me? Fantastic, I will do it, right? So you can infer that because he's excited and very much content about the commentary the professor emits, well, you say, well, he will probably do this because he was very excited when receiving that particular help from the professor, right? But in this case, he never talked about names in his research. What about look for non-government websites about pollution or variety in his sources? Well, as I told you, maybe this is a logical inference, but I ask you again, is this a response that you can have a justification for? I tell you that you cannot. Why? Because in any part, the student says, oh, now I will go and look just for other sources that are not governmental because I have had enough with these governmental sources. Or he never says, oh, yes, I have to stop looking for governmental sources because they are not actually compelling. Or he never says something like that. So that's the reason why, as I say, you shouldn't pick this one because, right, I mean, as I mentioned, he doesn't express anything negative about non-governmental websites. And finally, re-examine older outdated sources that he has already gathered. He didn't say that as well. Final question. Let's say here, oh, sorry. Let's listen.
Listen again. Professor say this. The professor say this.
Hey, my door is always open. During my office hours, at least.
I think this one is very clear, right? During my office hours, at least. When she says this, during my office hours, at least, is, for example, as when you say, right? Talk to me whenever you want, unless I am sleeping, right? Or something like, yes, you can find me here every single time, unless I'm working, right? It's like expressing when you say, you can find me here at any time or whenever you want, or I can do everything for you, but you always make an exception, right? For example, you say to your friends, come on, man, I will do everything for you if it is in my means, right? I will do everything for you if it is in my means. I mean, you're saying, yes, I will help you, anything I could, just as far I can do it, right? Because of course, you cannot help somebody in every single thing, right? You need to have your limitations because there are some things you cannot do. So here, when the professor says, of course, in my office hours, she's limiting, let's say, the help she can offer to her student, right? Because she's saying, yes, you can come with me at every point you want, dear student, but of course, if my office is open. Because imagine that the student takes this literally and he literally calls her professor, his professor, excuse me, at, I don't know, 2 a.m. in the morning. Like, that would be absurd, right? That's the reason why she's, of course, making a clarification every single time. Yes, but if my office is open, if my office door is open, right? Or if my office door is available. So she's basically expressing Yes, you can talk to me whenever I am available, not at every single time, but whenever I am available, whenever I am here working, you can come, right? She's making that particular boundary. So I think that's the correct answer. She's assuring the student that he is welcome to visit whenever she's available, okay? Not every single time, but when she's available. Fantastic. So before we finish the class, maybe you're saying, well, I mean, I want to practice more. Fantastic. And I have gathered for you, dear students, a lot of material. Yesterday, I sent to the WhatsApp group, I think, some material, but it was too short. I was afraid that you wouldn't have too much. So I decided to make a more ample list, and now I'm sending it to you right now, okay? So please get into your WhatsApp group, and you're going to find a very, very large list of free material that I gathered for you, and you can use it for practice, okay? For practicing more of this particular section, practices this weekend. When you have free time, get into your computer, take a piece of paper, a pencil, and practice by yourself. This material that I am sending you uses the same mechanism. It presents you some videos, it gives you the questions, the responses, and at the end, you can check them out just as we have done right now, and to, of course, correct your criteria, all right? Do you have any questions, dear students? Anything that you could clarify, commentaries?
No, thank you, girls. For me, it's everything clear.
Fantastic, very good. So let me stop here my screen. And before you go, dear students, I have to take your assistance. So please help me as well with the traditional poll that we always fill. You know that you help me a lot by filling this poll positively, all right? So please help me with that. Here you have it. And now I'm going to take your assistance. I know that there are some of you who are leaving me now. As Lucia said, there is one group that has ended its classes. I'm very sad because of it. I was actually very pleased to be with you. But as I say, if you need anything that I can help you with, your students of the group that is leaving the classes, please get in touch with me, okay? You have there my WhatsApp. I'm here for you to help you in every single time, as far as it is in, or as far as it is, excuse me, as far as it is in my means, right? Applying the the criteria that we just
Thank you,
listened
Carlos.
to.
I really enjoy your classes. I really have learned a lot, and of course, I'm gonna be in touch with you and let you know how my TOEFL exam went and everything. It was a pleasure to meet you and all my classmates.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Lucia.
Thank
So
you, Carlos.
Lucia's, no, my pleasure. Lucia is present. Raisa as well, right? Raisa,
Yes, present.
Thank you very much, Raisa, and also Sergio. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sergio, as well, dear Sergio.
Present,
Pleasure.
Carlos.
Yes, thank you very much. And let's go with the other group. Ramirez Camila.
Present.
Thank you very much, Camila. What about Mayra Alejandra Perez?
Present.
Thank you very much, Mayra. What about Salguero Fabiana?
Present.
Thank you very much, Fabiana. What about Quiroga Adriana?
I'm here.
Thank you very much, Adriana. What about Zúñiga Sergio?
Present.
Thank you very much, Sergio. What about Alondra Lisette?
Present.
Thank you very much, Lisette. What about José Miguel Quiroga? I think he was not here tonight, okay? Anaí Estefanía? Okay. And finally, Jorge Alberto Benítez?
Present.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So as I said, thank you very much to your students, to all of you. For those of you who are going to continue with the classes next week, see you later. And for those of you who are leaving me, thank you very much. Okay, it was a pleasure. And I hope to get in touch with you very much soon. All right?
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you very much.
Good
Bye.
night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Good
Have a
night.
weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Later.
Goodbye.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye, goodbye.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Carlos. See you on
Thank
Monday.
you, Sergio. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. See you.